Hello and good morning. Welcome, warm welcome to the Local Planning Authority webinar, which this morning is coming to in excess of 100 of you. So welcome to everybody from all over the country. There's several things I'm going to cover off in introducing our webinar. I'm going to tell you who you're going to be hearing from and what the topics are. I've got a few bits and pieces of housekeeping to sort out. Nothing to do with fire escapes on this occasion. You'll have to sort that out for yourself. And I'm going to pick up on exactly how you can interact in due course, because we've set this up so that you can interact in all sorts of ways. So first of all, just to get you into the flavour of what we're going to be dealing with today, we're going to start off big picture white paper. We're going to be helped by Howard Leathed and Oliver Lawrence, who are going to take us through some of the key issues in that regard. I'm going to return to that in just a moment. We're then going to turn to Jack Smythe, and I'm very pleased to welcome with him Sinead Davis, new to Chambers, and very pleased that that's the case. They're going to pick up on the major issues which are really taxing all of us, aren't they, in respect of PD rights and what we do with the used classes order. So much change there, and as the High Court case says, not very much discussion of it beforehand. Then to Sill and Ill, as it may become, with Scott Stemp. And then by 10 to 11, we're going to be with Christian Hawley, and we're going to look at just how do committees make robust decisions. Bit of law in that, I suspect. So that's the morning's programme. There's going to be some Q&A following on from that, but then we're going to split out into our groups of three, where we're going to be very much assisted by Richard Humphreys, QC, who's going to address case law update and some of the very interesting cases which he's been involved with very recently. Secondly, in respect of local plans, assisted by Hugh Richards. And thirdly, for those who've chosen that option, you'll be very fortunate to be with Leanne Buckley-Thompson dealing with appeals. Now, by way of introduction to the first presentation, I want to just tell you about my weekend. This weekend, as a fun family lockdown activity, I had to write an opinion on a sustainability appraisal. Exciting for the Kimblin family, I can tell you. Now look, that work brought this home to me, because I had to write this paragraph. The Planning Authority embarked on its SEA journey in 2009. The journey turned out to be epic. Later in that opinion, I was forced to conclude that notwithstanding the 13 years that the Planning Authority had been engaged in SA and SEA work, it wasn't legally compliant with the 2004 regs. That shouldn't be happening, should it? And that's the sort of thing which the Secretary of State is aiming at when he was speaking recently. I see Planning magazine reported just this morning. What the Secretary of State is saying is that what they're proposing is to make plan making a very meaningful exercise where local areas have even more control, and to do it quickly. 30 months, is that going to work? Is it really going to work? Secretary of State says he's sure that that can work. He says that the white paper says that the average plan takes 7 years. It's proposed to get this to 30 months. Sanctions for those who fail to do so. What he says is, we've worked with the sector, we've worked with experts who propose a 30-month statutory timetable, and we think that's deliverable. It will mean that it will have a period of intense activity. The situation at the moment, he says, is that no one is actually involved. So it's people talking to themselves for a very long period of time. But with that in mind, and this being a webinar, we now turn to Oliver Lawrence and to Howard Leathed, who are going to introduce the detail of the white paper so far as it might be coming to affect you.
Good morning. Thank you, Richard. On the 6th of August, the government published the White Paper Planning for the Future. This promises a fundamental reform of the planning system. The Prime Minister said in his foreword, "No more fiddling around the edges, not simply painting over the damp patches, but levelling the foundation and building from the ground up a whole new planning system." Not everyone supports this ambition. For instance, Lord Carnworth, who until recently was a planning specialist judge in the Supreme Court, said on the online planning discussion programme, "Have we got planning news for you?" He said, "I was rather cross with the foreword by the Prime Minister, which was way over the top. Whatever else you think about it, there just simply isn't a case for, as he put it, levelling the foundations and building a wholly new planning system from the ground up." Lord Carnworth continued, "That's never been a sensible way to approach law reform. I can't think of a single area where that has been thought a sensible thing to do." Lord Carnworth made similar comments in his formal consultation response. Others have also questioned whether the White Paper really does represent fundamental reform, as it leaves many areas untouched, enforcement being just one. The consultation period closed on the 29th of October. While responses were by no means entirely unsupportive of the proposed reforms, they included some detailed criticisms. In this talk, we will set out how the reforms would likely affect the work streams of LPAs. But it's important to bear in mind that any legislation would not necessarily include all of the proposed reforms. Indeed, there might not be any legislation. If the proposals in the White Paper do make it into legislation, perhaps the biggest impact on the work streams of LPAs would be the preparation of new local plans. As Richard mentioned, the White Paper criticises how long it currently takes to produce a local plan. It states, although it is a statutory obligation to have an up-to-date local plan in place, only 50% of local authorities as of June 2020 do, and local plan preparation takes an average of 7 years, meaning many policies are effectively out of date as soon as they are adopted. The White Paper proposes a more streamlined approach to local plans. It is envisaged that there would be shorter plans containing clearer rules. Land would be identified under 3 categories. First, growth areas, which would be suitable for substantial development. Second, renewal areas, which would be suitable for some development. And finally, protected areas, where development would be restricted. In terms of how the proposals would affect LPA work streams, the following would seem to be of particular relevance. First, the proposed local plans would be more front-loaded. Much of the detailed work, which currently takes place at the decision-taking stage, will be shifted forward to the plan-making stage. The aim would be to try to ensure greater certainty for developers. For instance, in growth areas, there would be outlined planning permissions and design codes. There would also be a clear process, perhaps even rules, to determine which proposals would get permission and which wouldn't. So LPAs would need to deal with more detailed work at the plan-making stage. The aim is to provide more certainty, but as some have noted, it would be potentially more difficult to front-load the work in this way, as developers would not necessarily be around to provide ideas. Second, as Richard also mentioned, there'd be a new 30-month statutory timescale for preparing a local plan. The White Paper proposes that in order to speed up the time it takes to produce a local plan, a new statutory timescale should be imposed, divided into 5 stages. During stage 1, which would take 6 months, the LPA would call for suggestions for areas designated as growth areas, renewal areas and protected areas. At stage 2, which would take 12 months, the LPA would draw up its proposed local plan. During stage 3, which would take just 6 weeks, the LPA would simultaneously first submit the plan to the Secretary of State for examination, and secondly also publicise the plan for the public to comment on. Then at stage 4, which would last for 9 months, a planning inspector appointed by the Secretary of State would consider whether the 3 categories in the emerging plan are sustainable according to a new statutory development test and accompanying national guidance. An LPA would have the right to be heard, whether in writing, face-to-face or by phone or video link. And finally, during stage 5, which would be for 6 weeks, the local plan map key and text would be finalised and the plan would come into force. A separate 42-month time period would be in place for LPAs which had adopted a new plan within the previous 3 years, or where a local plan had been submitted to the Secretary of State. Some consultation responses have doubted whether imposing a statutory deadline would in fact represent an improvement. For instance, in its consultation response, the RTPI said that it is not convinced that increasing speed would lead to better outcomes and that more certainty would be a better aim. Indeed, what prompted the Secretary of State's comments is that many have doubted whether it's even possible. However, if the proposed statutory timescale does make it into legislation, it would appear that there would likely be more work to do in less time when producing a plan. Third, there would be 2 separate stages of public consultation that LPAs would need to coordinate. These would take place, as I mentioned, during stage 1 and stage 3. It seems likely that stage 1, where an LPA calls for suggestions under the 3 categories, would generate a lot of responses and that it would take time to process. The consultation at stage 3 would perhaps not be as arduous, as the responses would go to the inspector examining the plan. There's been some criticism that an LPA would not be able to take into account the comments of the local community. But if the proposal goes forward, LPAs would need to be ready to deal with the administrative burden of dealing with 2 separate consultation exercises. Fourth, there would be greater use of digital technology. The white paper states that the local plans would be interactive and map-based and would be built upon data standards and digital principles. It further states that plans should be fully digitised and web-based following agreed web standards rather than document-based. The onus would be entirely on the LPA to come up with this. For instance, the government proposes to provide a template for local plans and subsequent updates that can be used across the country. The increase in the use of digital technology has been broadly welcomed in principle, but there are numerous logistical challenges that the government would need to address, not least the fact that the costs would likely be considerable. If the proposal goes forward, LPAs as a whole and individual officers would need to become a lot more tech-savvy, and while the government has indicated that it would contribute to the cost, LPAs would need to find at least some of the funding. And fifth and finally, the white paper indicates that an LPA would be required to review its local plan every 5 years, or more often if a change of circumstances had occurred. A change of circumstances might be where regular monitoring had detected problems with housing land supply. Where a review indicates that a new plan is needed, then the 30-month timetable would start all over again. Thus, LPAs would not be able to produce a plan and then breathe a sigh of relief. There would be the need to keep plans constantly under review. So in conclusion, it's by no means certain that all of these proposals will make it into legislation. But if the white paper does go forward, it looks like local plans would involve quite a lot of work in quite a tight timescale, and that they would need to be reviewed more frequently. This would not necessarily mean that individual officers would need to prepare to work harder and faster, but it seems likely that planning departments would need to be reorganised in order to meet this need. It further seems likely that they would need to find extra funding. I'll now hand over to Oliver Lawrence.
Thank you, Howard. So we move to the decision-taking aspect of the white paper. And Proposal 6 says that decision-making should be faster and more certain, with firm deadlines and make greater use of digital technology. With regard to time limits, the white paper says the well-established time limits of 8 or 13 weeks for determining an application should be a firm deadline, not an aspiration. And it then goes on just to indicate some proposals which would have some bite. It says this could involve the automatic refund of the planning fee for the application if they fail to determine it within the time limit, and that they want to explore whether some types of applications should be deemed to have been granted planning permission if there has not been a timely determination to ensure that targets are met. These biting proposals have already received some criticism in the responses to the consultation from the RTPI, among others. And so here you can see there's a question of compromise embodied here, which runs through the white paper. Namely, can you improve the efficiency of the planning system while maintaining the same degree of planning control? Or would overhauling the system in the name of efficiency backfire, perhaps? And there are obviously a wide range of views. Lord Conworth has expressed his view that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So on to digitization and the technological side of these proposals. Greater digitization of the application process is proposed by the white paper for one reason among many, so that applicants can have more certainty. Among other things, it is proposed that the validation of applications should be integrated with the submission of the application so that the correct information is provided right from the get-go. Fine, but the white paper also suggests that we should move towards machine-readable development management policies and codes. LPAs should expect to be working with new technology in the near future. The white paper lays great stress on the subject of design. In the introduction to the white paper, it makes this comment in the introduction. You can see tucked away in there, it says local plans do not provide enough certainty around the approved forms of development, relying on vague and verbal statements of policy, rather than the popularly endorsed visual clarity that can be provided by binding design codes. It aims to make efficiency gains by making policies more specific, or to be more accurate, encouraging the use of design codes to make planning decisions and planning judgment much more precise. The white paper goes on, the white paper say the MPPF will become primary, no provision for the inclusion of generic development management policies, which simply repeat national policy within local plans. And it is proposed to turn long lists of general policies to specific development standards. Well, I mean, it's that transformation, in my mind, it seems quite vague because as phrased, in my view, a development standard is not necessarily more specific than a policy. And these design guides and codes would ideally be produced on a twin track with a local plan. That's the idea. So they can either be included within the plan or prepared as supplementary planning documents. So I had a look at some local design guides in preparation for this short talk. And they consist of a large collection of mini policies. And in fairness, some of those are quite precise and clear. And here's one I liked. Dead ends should be designed as courtyards and not cul-de-sacs. Very good. You know where you are with that one. Another one, the height of window openings can be reduced as they get higher up the building. Excellent. So those are quite precise. But for every two of those, you get something like a high quality environment should be created by all developments, irrespective of density. So it isn't clear to me that design guides are going to speed the decision-making process up that much, because there will always have to be guidance or policies which are general in nature, because they are there to anchor and express the decision-maker's planning judgment, not to tell the decision-maker exactly what to approve and what to reject. And you could also argue, you could make the case, that past attempts by the government to streamline the content of local plans simply led to a proliferation of subordinate policy and guidance with different levels of determinative weight. Of course, as well, just because something is stated in a design code doesn't mean that parties can't fight over its proper interpretation. They can do that just as they can over the interpretation of development plan policy. And so in my view, this is my view, but this aspiration of the white paper to me is more about form than content. It may simply mean more SPDs. And it's not clear that it will save time at the decision-making stage. Attempting to cover all variables within national planning policy, guidance and codes would make these documents very time-consuming to prepare and complex to navigate. There are some alternative options which are indicated by the white paper. Of course, it proposes, rather than removing the ability for local authorities to include general development management policies and local plans, the scope of those policies could be limited to specific matters. And that proposal has received some support from, among others, the RTPI. And a further watered down alternative would be to allow local authorities a similar level of flexibility to set development management policies as under the current system, but with the exception that policies which duplicate the NPPF would not be allowed. And I can see that ban on duplication happening quite easily, actually, being, of course, mainly a matter for the examining inspector. And just briefly on environmental impact and what the white paper has to say about environmental assessment. Proposal 16 of the white paper says, we intend to design a quicker, simpler framework for assessing environmental impacts and enhancement opportunities that speeds up the process while protecting and enhancing the most valuable and important habitats and species in England. It goes on to say, it is vital that environmental considerations are considered properly as part of the planning and development process. However, the current frameworks for doing so, which include SEA, sustainability appraisal, and EIA, can lead to duplication of effort and overly long reports which inhibit transparency and add unnecessary delays. It then nods to Brexit and the potential to deviate from EU law. So there's a large part of crystal ball gazing in making predictions of what the government are going to do here. But for my money, I doubt that the government is going to be able to muster the political will to make any significant changes to the way that environmental impacts are assessed, which is a controversial area on which to tread. I mean, there is an argument, of course, that the process of EIA itself isn't a primary cause of delay. And one of the responses that I read, which did give me food for thought, is the view of the IEMA, is that the main case of delay is apparently over precautionary advice from risk-averse legal professionals, inflating the EIA scope. So obviously room for lots of debate there. So the general conclusions, you've heard ours. You've heard my insights, my doubts. It looks like there is some real organisation of planning departments coming, particularly in the direction of design. Planning decisions and local plans will obviously have to be quicker. That's the stated aim. And this will all require extra funding from somewhere. But back to the question that I posed in relation to environmental assessment, I think can be applied to actually all of these proposals. But is this a political priority for the government now? Is it likely to be in the future? And indeed, it's the stated aim. But at the moment, I don't see much sign of the political energy and focus required to carry out fundamental reforms to the planning system, at least not just yet. So thank you very much. And back to you, Richard. That's our talk.
Splendid. And thank you very much indeed. We move on straight away. Next up.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and good morning, everyone. Jack and I are going to be talking to you about the changes to permitted development and to the use classes order. I'm going to be covering the nuts and bolts of the changes, albeit in very broad brush headline terms, given the time constraints today. And Jack is going to be covering the practicalities of those changes and what they mean for you as local planning authorities, both in terms of decision taking and in terms of plan making. So I thought I'd start with some context first of all. They're set against some very significant changes to the planning system which have been proposed in 2020, but they've also coincided with economic pressures, particularly on housing, but also I think significantly in terms of the decline of the high street. And underpinning kind of those, this is significant because I think they underpin the thrust of those changes. Firstly, introducing greater flexibility, moving between a broader range of commercial uses of buildings through the use classes order. And secondly, through the introduction of the expanded permitted development rights to cover both demolition and construction of additional stories. So firstly, with regard to the changes to the use classes order. Now, the most significant change, in my view at least, comes from the introduction of new Class E, which is a commercial business and service class. Now, this is significant because of its breadth. So it revokes several of the old use classes and brings them together under this new heading. And as you can see there, it's quite wide-ranging. It covers buildings that were formerly used in use class A1, which are shops, A2, financial and professional services, A3, restaurants and cafes, B1, business use. And importantly, a change of use within that very broad class E won't require planning permission. The other significant addition is the addition of class F, which breaks down into two main parts. The first is also very broad. It covers education, museums, galleries, public halls, etc. And F2 creates a new local community category, which covers shops, halls, areas of outdoor sport and recreation. The use classes order, as amended, also contains a broader sui generis category to include pubs, hot food takeaways, cinemas, and the like. Like I say, a whistle-stop tour of the use classes order, but it's worth noting that this will probably have some quite far-reaching practical implications, which Jack will come on to in due course. It's also worth noting that the use classes order can't be excluded by operation of an Article 4 direction. So again, local planning authorities' ability to curtail its use is somewhat limited. Moving therefore quickly on to the changes to permitted development, there's an introduction of a new class ZA, which covers demolition, certain demolition works, and then there are several classes which introduce the ability to facilitate extra stories being built on houses. It covers individual homes, detached buildings, some commercial buildings, terraces and detached buildings. It's worth mentioning that most of these still require prior approval, albeit that there are considerable limits on local planning authorities to curtail development based on local planning, based on prior approval. And with that, I'll hand over to Jack, who's going to talk about the practicalities.
Thanks, Sinead. The key take-home message from the changes is that it signals a loss of control on the part of councils, so that a significant number of schemes which up to now would have been fall within the formal planning process will now fall outside it. So what I'm going to do is first of all give my top 5 practical tips for officers. Secondly, consider what we might uncharitably describe as damage limitation as far as councils are concerned. And then finally, sketch out some of the broader implications of the changes. So dealing with my top tips, the first top tip is there will be a need to devote more officer time and resources to consideration of the prior notification applications, whereas in the past it may have been more inexperienced and more junior officers which dealt with this breed of application. Given how significant they could be, it may well be that more senior officers will have to have a hand in it. So in the past, an officer who perhaps made a hash out of a barn conversion dwelling under Class Q, the implications of that wouldn't be hugely significant. Going forward, the implications could be greater. The second top tip is there may well be an appetite amongst members to have a greater say on considering these sorts of applications and having more of these prior notification committee. So if this is something which comes about, there may be a greater need for member training, and councils may have to tweak their constitutional arrangements. I don't know to what extent any particular local authority standing orders allow applications of this sort not to be delegated, but that will be something to look at. Third top tip, and it may be stating the obvious, which is that councils will need to have robust systems to diarise the time limits, because we know that these prior notification applications have a default setting, so silence is taken as acceptance. So it's very, very important that local authorities have systems in place such that if an officer goes off on sick unexpectedly or there's annual leave, that the system is in place to make sure that an application doesn't go through on the nod when it wasn't intended as such. Penultimate top tip is to clearly establish the existing lawful use. So if there has been an intervening unlawful use, this may remove the possibility of an applicant relying upon a given permitted development right. And my final top tip is to try and focus on what we might describe as the highest impact development. So Sinead has mentioned under Class E how you can switch between the uses. So let's say you've got a small shop which is converted into a nursery or a healthcare centre. That's a sort of conversion which is likely to increase vehicular movements, increase amount of noise and disruption with parents dropping off kids and people going for appointments every 10 minutes. So these are sorts of breed of conversion which is likely to have an impact and ought to be given particular scrutiny. The next section is entitled Damage Limitation. And it seems to me there's two things to keep in mind. Firstly, that councils can make greater use of conditions to extinguish permitted development rights or certain permitted development rights. And secondly, that one area to look into is how one interprets the conditions attached to particular permitted development rights. So does one interpret them narrowly or does one interpret them broadly? And just to give you an example, I've been advising an applicant who, under Class Q, wants to convert a barn into a dwelling. It's actually a very, very small barn building, which would create a very, very small dwelling. And in that particular case, the council has interpreted the reference in the condition to Class Q of design and external appearance to cover the internal configuration of the building. Effectively, they're concerned that it's too small and pokey and doesn't provide sufficient amenity for people living there. And the counter argument is that if you've got an intrinsically small farm building, you can only create an intrinsically small dwelling, and it's not a question of design, it's what you're playing with. So that's the nature of the argument. But until the High Court says otherwise, councils have a broad discretion exercising their planning judgment. So I suspect interpreting, stretching the meaning of particular terms may be something that local authorities do a bit of when trying to constrain the operation of some of these new changes. The final part of my presentation is looking at the broader implications. And it seems to me there's some good news and there's some bad news. So for local authorities, the good news is that a lot of these permitted development rights are likely to increase the number of dwellings, so that there's likely to be a greater number of windfalls. So if you are a local authority which has a slightly dicey 5-year supply, if you don't make a windfall allowance in your 5-year supply calculation, it may well be that these changes provide an expectation of a delivery, and therefore you can make a windfall allowance. Or if you only at the moment provide a very modest windfall allowance, this liberalisation may well allow you to elevate and increase the value of that windfall. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's likely that these changes will give rise to a greater volume of enforcement work. So not only checking that what you've consented is actually being built, but also the greater scope for statutory nuisance, because if you are introducing, for example, residential development at locations which hitherto would not have been acceptable, that plainly gives rise to potential conflicts of uses. We're all used to city centre apartments with young people living, above restaurants and next to bars and nightclubs and all the rest of it, and having those sensitive receptors usually isn't problematic because you have conditions to the planning permission which provides for lots of sound insulation and all the rest of it. But if you have under permitted development rights these sorts of dwellings being created, you may not have the provision for all that Rolls-Royce sound insulation. So the scope for councils being drawn into complaints about noise, and then the aggrieved local business, one can well understand, would be frustrated that they've only been doing what they've been doing up to now, and because a dwelling's been created which otherwise wouldn't have been, that their business arrangements could be constrained. Over to you, Richard.
Sinead, Jack, thank you very much indeed, and likewise thank you to both Oliver and to Howard. It's amazing, isn't it? 40 minutes in, we've already packed in so much information and practicality. So thank you very much to the four of you. We've got 2 more laps to go in this morning's session. We're going to turn now, with the considerable assistance of Mr. Scott Stemp to Sill, or as I've referred to it, it may yet become ill. Scott.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about some recent developments in Sill, some of the practical issues that are connected with the same, and some of the solutions that you might look to resolve that. First up, Sill and phased development. The Oval Estates case. Some relevant facts before we get into the nitty-gritty of it for you. Outline permission was granted in 2016 with a Section 106 agreement. Now, the outline permission did not refer to any phasing of the development, but the Section 106 did refer inside it to phasing of what was permitted. Reserve matters approved in April of 2017 and the completion of an assumption of liability notice, with development commencing a year later in 2018. 2019 there was a non-material amendment, and then the authority issued notices requiring payment of Sill, and the notices required full payment of Sill for the entire development. The developer sought to argue that Sill should actually be calculated as a phased development, pointing to the reference in the Section 106 to phasing, and also the appearance on the face of some of the plans submitted with the reserved matters referencing phasing. The High Court, however, concluded this was not a phased permission. And the reason it was not a phased permission was because there was no operative part of the planning permission that required the development to be undertaken in phases. The permission itself didn't suggest development would be undertaken in phases. And although phasing was referenced in the Section 106, the planning permission did not state that the Section 106 was part of the permission and part of the development that had been described. There was, it was accepted a reference to phasing on the plans submitted in the reserved matters, but this was not sufficient to make the planning permission a phased permission. The non-material amendment that came after development had commenced, the court observed that actually, in contrast to the provisions in the Sill regs for variants of chargeable development in relation to Section 73 permissions, there was no equivalent for non-material amendments, and accordingly the non-material amendment didn't alter the calculation of the charge development. The court also observed that the liability to pay arose at the commencement of the development, not the issue of the liability notice. So what then are the key takeaways in relation to Sill and phased development? Well, the first is primarily that authorities and all parties need to take care when permission is being granted, so that everybody is clear as to whether the development that is being granted is going to be a phased development or not. And if it is intended to be a phased development, there should be clear provisions set out in the operative part of the planning permission, showing that the permission is intended to be phased. A reference to an accompanying Section 106 or any other document will only be sufficient to make it phased if that document is specifically incorporated into the operative parts of the permission. Now, combining two winning factors, the combination of coronavirus and Sill regulations, the Sill Coronavirus Amendment England Regulations 2020 bestows a discretionary power on a collecting authority to defer Sill payments for a maximum of 6 months and to disapply late payment interest and surcharge payments. Regulation 72A, as it now is, details the process for the deferral. It is available to small and medium enterprises with a turnover annually of under £45 million who have been served with a demand notice and who are required to pay Sill between 22nd of July 2020 and 31st of July 2021. and the final criteria being that they are experiencing financial difficulty for reasons connected to the effects of coronavirus, resulting in difficulty paying that amount. All of those matters, but primarily the last point, are required to be substantiated in evidence. Charging authorities are expected to be positive in their approach to this, but developers must also equally be prepared to be open with their financial predicament. It's important to note that, like with other deferrals, for example, in the tax system, this COVID deferral is precisely that. It is not an exception from payment. It is a deferral for a maximum of 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, the money will then fall due to be paid. One matter to bring you right up to speed: in force from today, the 16th of November 2020, the Community Infrastructure Levy (Amendment) (England) number 2 regulations, another snappily titled amendment to the Sill regs. This incorporates the first homes within the social housing Sill relief under Regulation 49. First homes are those, we'll recall, that are sold to those with a local connection with no more than 70% of market rate, with a planning obligation to retain the 70% sale price on future sales. There is a clawback provision, but the clawback provision only relates to the first sale of the home. The planning obligation is intended to thereafter take over, protecting the first home status of the properties. There's also an amendment to the discretionary social housing Sill relief, Regulation 49A. The amendment is in relation to the clawback, in relation to properties that are sold at a 20% discount from market price on future sales. That would ordinarily be a 7-year clawback period. However, it gives the option to use a Section 106 obligation to secure the 20% discount on future sales. And where that occurs, the clawback provision will relate again only to the first sale. So bringing the discretionary social housing relief under Regulation 49A in line with the clawback provisions for first homes now under Regulation 49. In better news, and possibly more popular than Mark Morrison's 1996 platinum hit Return of the Mac, is the return of the monitoring fee. We will all be familiar with the Oxfordshire case in 2015, where the High Court found that monitoring fees were not necessary to make development acceptable in planning terms. They therefore did not meet the requirements of Regulation 122, a decision which I think we can fairly say has been subjected to a degree of mixed judicial treatment. However, new Regulation 122(2)(a) identifies specifically that fees associated with monitoring and reporting on obligations are capable of being charged through Section 106 agreements, provided that they fairly and reasonably relate in scale and kind to the development, and they do not exceed the authority's estimate of its costs of monitoring development over the lifetime of the obligation that relate. The primary takeaway for this is, first of all, of course, the reintroduction of monitoring fees as being permissible in Sill terms and Section 106 agreements. The second main takeaway being, of course, that authorities will then need to, however, to be able to produce lifetime estimates and demonstrate their costs are fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind, because that will be the key to unlocking the ability to recover fees for monitoring and reporting on planning obligations. We turn to what are going to be new infrastructure funding statements. These were brought in under the 2019 amendments to the Sill regulations, and the first of them will be due from the 31st of December 2020. The detailed requirements of infrastructure statements are set out at Schedule 2 to the regulations. I'm not going to go through them for you, but they broadly include lists of infrastructure types and projects to be wholly or partly Sill funded, reporting on neighbourhood Sill collecting and spending, reports detailing particularly Section 106 financial and non-financial obligations, which can include Section 278 agreements, and details on other elements of Section 106 agreements, specifically affordable housing and school places provided. The old Regulation 123 lists had some variance of detail in them between authorities as to the nature and type of infrastructure to be provided, and they certainly didn't help with transparency about infrastructure spending. The real point here is that the infrastructure statements should make it much easier to communicate the benefits of development to your local community. The community at the moment really can struggle, I think, to understand where and how infrastructure monies that are collected are spent. And the infrastructure statement, although it is something which is going to, I think, probably substantially increase the workloads on officers and local authorities in terms of the preparation and presentation of the infrastructure statement, really does present actually a fantastic opportunity for local authorities to be able to engage with and communicate the nature and extent of their spending of infrastructure monies. The potentially significant cost of producing the statement is something which can be defrayed or recovered entirely through the Sill levy itself. Administration and reporting fees are expressly allowable under the Sill regulations, but of course this will key into the central balancing exercise in setting Sill levy rates between securing sufficient financial contributions to cover the costs of preparing the infrastructure statements, whilst at the same time not being so high as to endanger viability. Just briefly, and connected to the reporting requirements, is the introduction under Regulation 121B of express requirements on parish and town councils to report in financial years on their Sill receipts. Although parish councils already have financial accounting requirements, it may come as something of a shock to parish council and town councils the very specific obligations that now exist under Regulation 121B as to their financial reporting obligations. And connected with the same is the update to the planning practice guidance in relation to the neighbourhood portion and again coronavirus considerations. This is the differential between the 15% that's payable as a neighbourhood portion of Sill where there is no referendum on a neighbourhood plan, and the 25% that is payable after a referendum. The guidance suggests an additional 10% being payable from 6 weeks after the authority issues its decision statement detailing an intention to send a neighbourhood plan to referendum, since that is when the referendum would normally have been expected to take place. With the express observation, the money should still only be used toward the provision, improvement, replacement, operation or maintenance of infrastructure to support the development of the charging authority's area. The Regulation 59E clawback will not automatically apply to the additional uplift between the 15 and 25% that is paid in the absence of the referendum, because that is not a sum that is paid under either Regulation 59A or B. And just on the question of the clawback under Regulation 59E, a point of practice potentially for local authorities, it may be important to go back to your parish councils and town councils and make them aware that there are clawback provisions under Sill Regulation 59E. I've spoken with a number of parish councils and town councils recently, many of whom were unaware that unspent Sill is repayable after 5 years, and were also unaware that Sill spent otherwise than in accordance with Regulation 59C, that is the provision, improvement, replacement or maintenance of infrastructure or other matters concerning demands on development to place in an area. If it's spent otherwise than in accordance with Regulation 59C, it can also be the subject of a clawback. As I say, that came as something of a surprise to many of the parish councils and town councils that I spoke to, and so it may be an important point to just double check with parishes and town councils in your administrative areas that they are alive to and aware of the potential for clawback of Sill monies. Which really brings me to the concluding point for and the main point that I want to make in relation to Sill, and particularly the distribution of Sill monies. The key takeaway in relation to Sill spending and funding, it seems to me, is cooperation and communications. The risk is ending up with various authorities in an area who all have siloed pots of cash and who ultimately end up with the uncoordinated provision of infrastructure and inefficient spending on infrastructure, and a community that can't easily see the extent of infrastructure spending. And the key issue, the key requirement I think, to help undercut that, and what infrastructure statements should be used to try and assist with, is to engage various authorities with spending abilities to cooperate and coordinate and communicate about how that infrastructure money is spent. That is what I wanted to speak with you this morning about the Community Infrastructure Levy. And I think now you're going to hear from Christian in relation to decision taking and planning committees.
Well, thank you, Scott, and that's exactly right. And we are very much looking forward to that presentation from Christian. It's going to be very interesting to see what he has to say on that topic. It's a developing area, and it's going to develop still further in the coming months. I can assure you, having been in the Court of Appeal, knocking that exact point about last week. Christian.
Welcome all. My topic, as you well know, how can we make planning committee decision taking more effective and robust? I think from the outset, I do feel rather like a turkey voting for Christmas by preparing and delivering a presentation on how to keep me out of work, either on behalf of interested parties, claimants, or indeed local planning authorities. Now, 15 minutes isn't an awfully long time to cover such a wide and potentially limitless area. The issues are, of course, broad, but what I'm going to do is just take as a starting point a litany which I would commend to all of you. And if I just share my screen, I should imagine that you will all be able to see what I'm talking about. So starting backwards, and what I mean by that is when you're preparing or dealing with a planning application or preparing a planning officer's report, the really important thing to think about is, well, where is this going to end up? The obvious point is it's going to end up with your planning committee, but that isn't necessarily where it's going to end. Of course, it could end up at appeal. It could end up in the High Court. If you are very, very lucky, you could end up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's that back end that I want to consider first, because what the courts have said about planning committees and officers' reports are observations which I would recommend you familiarise yourselves with. And actually, whilst it might appear arcane, impenetrable, and something that really most people would prefer to avoid, actually, as set out in the case of Mansell and Tonbridge and Malling, it was said there by the court, Lindblom LJ, the principles on which the court will act when criticism is made of a planning officer's report to committee are well settled. But perhaps most importantly, the principles are not complicated. And really, they're not. There's plenty of complication around the statutory provisions, depending on the particular case, or indeed technical arguments about a particular planning application. There might be environmental points, there might be noise points, there might be health and safety points. But the principles upon which a court will intervene are not that complicated, because the court, of course, isn't considering a planning application. It isn't considering the merits of a proposal. What it is considering is whether the appointed decision maker, in our case the planning committee, but equally it could be a planning officer under delegated authority, or it could be an inspector acting on behalf of the Secretary of State, or indeed the Secretary of State himself. But they are the decision takers and the decision makers, not the courts. So whilst judicial review is something which is often spoke of, and there are startling examples which we'll see, generally speaking, the principles are simply legal principles, ensuring that a decision is taken lawfully. And that's the important thing to bear in mind. And the other thing that I would recommend that you do is to get a hold of this judgment. Googling it will suffice. It's available on the government's website, the Judiciary website. And it doesn't take long to read no more than 2 A4 pages of that judgment in order to put in mind those things that the court will consider and to bear those in mind when preparing an officer's report. And that's at paragraph 42 of that judgment. And quite simply, what that says is the question for the court will always be whether, on a fair reading of the report as a whole, the officer has materially misled the members on a matter bearing upon their decision, and the error has gone uncorrected before the decision was made. And it's got to be a material error as well. Simply a forensic analysis of a planning officer's report seeking to find fault won't cut the mustard so far as the courts are concerned. And really, whilst examples are set out in that case, so for example, a significant error of fact or a plain misdirection as to the meaning of a relevant policy, or simply a failure to consider a matter which should have been considered and advise upon it. They are simply examples because I suppose the slightly terrifying aspect of judicial review is that, whilst the principles are settled, the facts aren't and the circumstances aren't. So that's what keeps us all in business, is the ever evolving and to a degree the ingenuity of claimants in bringing claims. But of course, every case turns on its own facts, and what needs to be considered right from the outset is, well, yes, every case is different and every case might be complicated. But what I need to do is to simply set out that for my committee without misdirecting them in any way. So some practical points. First one, really important, don't be rushed. Everybody's under pressure. Everybody's under time pressure. As local authorities, you are, of course, under a requirement to determine applications within the statutory time frame. If you don't, potentially you can face appeal. And of course, it's a matter of consideration of performance as well. But what shouldn't happen, and what often gives rise to claims, is where an application or an applicant has really been pushing for a determination because, they have commercial concerns, the earlier the better, etc., etc. But particularly large, major applications, that they can have a wide variety of implications. They can have a wide variety of consultee responses. There's a lot of information which needs to be considered, digested, reduced and condensed so that the planning committee can take it into account. If there are matters that are outstanding, don't feel that you need to be rushed to, well, in this case, the November committee because somebody needs something before Christmas. It's in those decisions and reports which are rushed, which one often finds that's where the errors are made. Second point, also to do with applicants, beware the goose with the golden egg. There's always those planning applications or proposals for development which everybody wants to see. It's going to provide jobs, it's going to regenerate an area, it's going to do something that's really good, and effectively everybody agrees that this is a good thing. But of course, when we talk about everybody, often there are those which are affected by a proposal which may not consider it, on their particular narrow view, as a good thing. So when an application is one which has political support, it has support in the community, don't be tempted to give it an easier ride, because there will always be those who don't want to see a particular application proceed. And those schemes which appear logical, appear a given that they should be approved, they should be treated with the same rigour and examination of detail as those which an authority might not want to approve. Third practical point, 4 eyes are better than 2, peer review, a bit of poetry for you this morning. What I mean by that is simply, we can all end up working in isolation. barristers more than most, and particularly under the circumstances that we've all been facing since March. Everybody's working from home now, pretty much. That will continue for many months. Local authorities have been very proactive in continuing to be able to make decisions. I think arguably were more proactive, in fact, than the courts. There was a long period where the courts were disrupted, but local authorities quickly got the hang of remote meetings in particular. But one important thing is, if you're the officer dealing with an application, then have somebody else have a look at it. Fresh pair of eyes can often throw up something which, having been buried in the detail of something, you might well have missed. Fourthly, keep it plain and simple. There's no real need for technical language in a committee report. Members are members of the community. They are doing a job. It requires them to understand the framework within which they need to operate, and it requires them to understand the implications and the detail of a planning application sufficient for them to be able to make a decision on it. But simply making a committee report complicated through use of language or terms doesn't assist the decision maker, and also, should the matter then go on to appeal or to the courts, it doesn't assist in that regard either. So to my mind, plain and simple is always best. Now, if I could give you one word of advice, heritage would be it. The vast majority of judicial review challenges that I've been involved in for, both sides, or all three sides, interested parties as well, and upon which I advise, the vast majority involve heritage matters to some degree or another. And what's remarkable is that actually, it's a relatively straightforward matter to deal with. In fact, I could go so far as to say an almost pro forma approach could be adopted for the purpose of planning committee reports to set out, at least as a guide or framework, for the author of that report to make sure that all the boxes are ticked. So really, you need to, in the committee report, understand and explain the statutory duty of the Planning and Listed Buildings Act, understand and explain the provisions of the MPPF, what level of harm are we dealing with, less than substantial, substantial, if it's less than substantial, the relevant unbalanced test, do the public benefits outweigh the heritage harms taken in isolation? What about designated heritage assets versus undesignated heritage assets? All that needs to be explained, but it's the same in every case. You apply the facts to it differently, but the framework remains the same. So why not have a standard wording? And also, for the particular case, understand and explain the heritage assets and the impact upon them. Doesn't, again, need to be in vast detail, but there needs to be something in there. The decision maker needs to have taken it into account and understand the tests and undertake them. Objections. Often this can lead you to a point where, yes, you've had enough of objectors, you've had enough of objections, they're all rolling in, quite often the same things are being raised, but they really shouldn't be brushed over. Are all objectors or objections equal? Well, yes and no. Every objection, unless it's entirely irrelevant, is a matter which needs to be taken into account. But the nature of the objection, its relevance to the application, and the author of it does determine what weight it should be attributed and how it should be dealt with in an officer's report and by a planning committee. So, for example, statutory consultees, the views of a statutory consultee carry, inevitably greater weight than somebody who is not an expert in that regard. And then sitting in the middle, there's also special interest or expert bodies. Think the RSPB or the Victorian Society. Are they raising issues which are actually slightly different to those that might be raised by Historic England or the Natural England? And if they are raising matters which are slightly different, are they being taken into account? And then, of course, not to denigrate the point, there's everybody else. And it's very easy to lump everybody else together and simply provide a précis of their objections. But that doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't valid and shouldn't be taken into account. And there are examples out there where, a local community has demonstrated that there might be adverse, severe highways impacts, despite the expert saying that there isn't. So objections to be remembered and borne in mind. Then there's the points which are black and white. These are the things where discretion doesn't come into it. This is pure interpretation and pure, law, effectively. Development plan policy. What does it mean? You need to tell the planning authority what it means, and you need to make sure that the interpretation is correct. Permitted development rights, going back to the earlier presentation, much expanded, probably going to start going to committee. But what do those terms mean? What do those conditions mean? Section 73, applications to amend existing permissions, of course, create a new permission, but the amount of times that causes difficulty and authorities end up with numerous different standalone planning permissions, all of which have slightly different terms and conditions. And then, of course, planning conditions and Section 106 obligations themselves got to meet the tests. Those tests aren't new, the 6 tests for planning conditions, the Regulation 122 tests for Section 106 obligations. They've been around for years and years and years. And again, something which could be subject to a pro forma approach in a template officer's report. Really no reason to get those wrong. So here's my entirely unscientific top 3. Heritage, number 1, absolutely every time, from the biggest schemes to the smallest. For example, I've dealt with schemes involving heritage or the judicial reviews of permissions which have been granted for, residential tower in excess of 50 stories, through to a poultry unit in the countryside, which may or may not have impinged on views of a heritage asset. So heritage pops up everywhere. I mean, perhaps that's why it's so prevalent in judicial review challenges, but definitely my number 1, and really not one to get wrong. Secondly, environmental impact assessment and habitats regulations assessments. Slightly scientific in nature, of course, but you've got statutory consultees to assist you in those regards. The usual issue is where simply thought hasn't been given to it and an EIA hasn't been carried out or an appropriate assessment hasn't been carried out. That's straight to go, do not collect £200 and permission quashed. Thirdly, broad range, considerations, material or otherwise. Is a consideration material? If so, the committee should be taking it into account. It needs to be reported to them. Is it immaterial? Therefore, it shouldn't be reported to them, or if it is, they should be expressly told not to take it into account. The favourites here are offerings from developers or applicants, which are to sweeten the pill, as it were, and say, well, my scheme's going to deliver X, Y, and Z, and also these other financial contributions to whatever it might well be in the town centre. Are they really material considerations? Should they really be taken into account? That's something which definitely requires consideration. So those are the top 3. But of course, the point to bear in mind is there's always going to be something coming from left field. Recent case this year was an authority's decision to issue enforcement proceedings against the owner of a listed building. What was that lawful? On the basis that the urns, which were not affixed to the building, they stood on piers, were they within the meaning of a building for the purposes of the Act? If they were, then the fact that they'd been removed and sold meant that there had been unauthorised works. If they were not, then there weren't. went all the way to the Supreme Court. So no matter how well prepared one might be, there's always something new, and that's the exciting challenge. But the important point to bear in mind is the principles are always the same. And once you've got a grip of those principles, what it means is you can knock out a decent percentage of those judicial review challenges that you might otherwise face. This is a topic which you could speak about for many hours, but my time is done. So thank you very much.
And thank you to you, Christian, for taking us through what, as you say, is such an enormous topic with crystal clear clarity. That brings this morning's session to a close with an enormous thank you for the enormous attendance. The attendance has been absolutely terrific from around the country. Thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you and being with you on some future occasion. Thank you.